Just gonna have a quick math lesson here. So I just go, they already use them. Great, well thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you all. This paper is part of a larger project that investigates developments of theatricality and performativity in Italian feminism. I'm interested in using these terms methodologically as lenses through which to better understand Italian feminism, and also as the subjects themselves, asking how theater and performance has complicated questions related to gender in Italian society. Today, I will focus on the first part of this project, aiming to analyze what Sharon Wood has called the color, show, and vivid representations of women's lives in women's marches and demonstrations in Italy. Theatricality is not entirely unique to Italian feminist practices. One need only think of the recent slut walks in Canada and the US. To conjure an instance of how social movements can make use of theatrics to articulate a point. In fact, the reason that we find aspects of performance in Italian feminism is not so different. I will argue today that one of these reasons why performance is present in Italian feminist activity concerns historical debates in Italian feminism surrounding language. It also embraces another important aspect of Italian feminism, which is the joy in connecting with one another. And this has taken place in the storytelling practice of autocoscienza, so we're going back to that. My discussion begins with a broad reading of Italian feminism in the 1970s through the lens of theatricality, tracing its relationship to performance until the early 80s, around when it suffers a change, and ending with the role of theatricality today in a post-feminist third wave. I should clarify that my understanding of post-feminism is not diametrically or even diachronically opposed to third wave feminism. I understand the former to signal the flexibility and even permeability of feminism, and the latter to emphasize its intersectionality. Today, Italian feminists engage in theatrical and performative gestures in a variety of ways. Perhaps in part as a response to the slow commodification of women over at least a score of years, indelibly linked to the Berlusconi reign, but also, and this is what I'm particularly interested in, through the vocabulary of 1970s feminism. Theoretically, I'm working through discourses on language, particularly those explored by Caballero and groups such as Dumau, and that have also stretched across borders to dialogue with Anglo-American and French feminist thought. From a performance perspective, language also incorporates the body, a concept in itself integral to feminism, as we've discussed today. And I would like to work towards furthering some of the existing theories on language to explicitly include the language of the body during speeches, protests, meetings, and the like. As I will consider, by looking at elements and developments of theatricality in Italian feminism, we can appreciate a little explored language of movement, one that addresses not what feminists said, or even the verbal language with which they said it, but how they said it in the performance of presentation. Before I continue, let me just define some key terms. Namely performance, performativity, and theatricality. There's some slippage amongst these terms, both in and out of the academy, in part related to cultural and linguistic differences, and inevitably in my talk today there will be some overlap. Starting with just performance, I need to confront its liveness, its immediacy, and its non-repeatability. This is particularly important considering visual representations of women and what we are referring to as the Berlusconi era, since so many of those are reproductions of images. This term is also useful in its vast envelopment of cultural practices beyond the stage. Through the work of anthropologists since the 1950s, I'm thinking of Victor Turner or Margaret Mead even, performance has come to include not only theatrical performance, but also cultural performances, giving equal status to rituals, sports, political events. And the term performance performativity has its roots with J.L. Austin's theory of speech act, where saying is doing. The concept has been challenged and reworked across disciplines by scholars such as Derrida, Butler, Seeley, and Chomsky, the linguistics field, among others. Today, I will argue that the inverse of Austin's idea regarding performative speech is also true. Inverse of Austin's speech is also true. In certain instances, performance is also articulation. For Italian feminists, performance is also language. I feel like they want to come and talk. So finally, theatricality. It's perhaps the trickiest of the terms because of the tendency toward a more uncritical definition, where it is used to mark texts or performances that gesture to their own production. There's also a pejorative connotation associated with theatricality, invoking a presumption of fakery and false representation. One meaning of theatricality relies heavily on the nature of spectatorship. To describe something as theatrical describes an experience that requires the presence of a spectator and is thus a dynamic of perception. They're like so marky. It's this interpretation of theatricality that I wish to invoke. So just in case of distractions, theatricality in terms of dialogue, a spectator. And I think that interpretation in particular speaks to one of the main characteristics of Italian feminism, which is, as Leslie Caldwell has written, the ability to encourage small groups and the intimate practice of autocoscienza, while also organizing mass mobilizations and demonstrations. So I'm talking about both small and the gigantic. Within this, there are layers of exchange taking place, rendering between the individuals within the small group and the identities of those groups themselves, to the gathering of thousands of people. Theatricality in this definition concerns these types of dialogic relationships. The dimension of performance in Italian feminism has been little studied, and mentions of performance gestures are often only in passing. In an issue of the Women's Studies International Quarterly, for example, Daniela Colombo recalls how 1974, when the campaign for a referendum to abolish divorce began, instead of standing on a platform and addressing people from above, feminists chose different methods, such as street theater, songs, music boxes, puppets. Similarly, as Lucia Chiavola Birnbaum's seminal 86 book on Italian feminism, she describes the UDI's annual festival as a mix of entertainment and politics. There were also family affairs where men cooked, children played, and participants were invited to dance. Additionally, dimensions of performance have been present in Italian feminism in more subtle ways. While it has also been criticized, I join in many in hailing the possibility of the autocoscienza practice, which I see closely aligned to certain performance traditions, perhaps most obviously storytelling and oral histories. The main trait in this practice that I would like to consider with respect to today's feminism, however, is the aspect of pleasure and joy, even ecstasy, in the way some participants describe it. As Bono and Kemp point out in their formative book, Italian Feminist Thought, autocoscienza suggests the possibility, the importance, the intricacy and beauty of relationships between women. There are many examples of this. The Libreria delle Donne di Milano's 1987 piece, Non credere di avere dei diritti, describes autocoscienza as una pratica semplice e geniale. Da sempre, si può dire, le donne hanno l'abitudine di trovarsi fra di loro per parlare delle loro cose al riparto dell'orecchio maschile. L'autocoscienza si iniziò su questa pratica sociale diffusa quando poco considerata e le diedi dignità politica. In other words, it was a political discussion that aligned itself with the private sphere. Participants shared parts of their lives as they began to contextualize them, and think about how personal experiences interacted with their ideas on women's rights more broadly. This practice was almost Brechtian insofar as it embraced both education and entertainment. As Balestrini and Moroni state, si prova piacere per parlare insieme, non si riunisce due donne per asciugare lacrime. Of this piacere, in a 1973 issue of Sotto Sopra, one woman explains, ho vissuto che le donne, per le donne, possono essere creature di cui ci si può fidare, a cui ci si può fidare, con cui si sta bene insieme, con cui si può suonare flauti e tamburelli per notti intere, con cui ci si diverte a ballare, a discutere, a fare progetti e renderli reali, innamorarsi delle donne. Era il primo passo per arrivare a riconoscere anche me con gioia nelle donne, per ricostruire la mia identità non solo nel dolore e la rabbia, ma nell'entusiasmo e nel riso. With this almost bacchanalian description and its ecstatic enthusiasm and affection, it is no wonder that some of the many protests today also share this joy as a vital counterpart to the serious subjects that they confront. It's not hard to invoke Bakhtin and the carnivalesque, since the pleasure in simply being together and the expression of that through music, dance, puppets, and costumes resonates as a mode that subverts dominant structures. What I find particularly useful about this performative dimension is the way in which it confronts questions on language, on which Italian feminists have produced many theories. In reference to accusations in the late 80s that some of Cavarero's work was excessively obscure, Bono and Kemp talk about the difficulty of, quote, trying to express new, unexplored concepts for which there is no existing framework within the tradition of Western philosophical and political thought. The effort of formulating such a concept as woman as subject in a language of the other impedes certain kinds of clarity and fluency, end quote. This notion of difference in sexism and language is of course not only a concern for Italian feminists. Different cultures address these issues in different ways. In the Italian debates on difference, the notion of equality played an important role. I'm thinking here of Lanzi's famous declaration in Supremo su Hegel that equality is juridical definition or difference is an existential principle. And it's also a biological one. As Cavareiro has argued, the body itself, as opposed to only language, must be signified and reconstructed. Along with historical experience, that there is that biological dimension. In the Italian debate on language, this discourse is literally embodied. This is where theatricality, once again, becomes essential in two main ways. First, it is consistent with grounding the debates back in the body, because it is a physical mode of expression through music and dance, but also physical in the sensation of pleasure, an emotional state that invites energy, motivation, and thrill in ways that connect to the body. Second, the expression, the acts themselves, the dancing, the laughter, the performance of the delta symbol that I showed in the other images, those are iterations of a language that perhaps, in these instances, with these specific groups of people, we might call a feminist language. Although there's not time today for an in-depth analysis, I would like to suggest that the writing of the body back into feminist discourse also backfired, and that it was co-opted and grossly manipulated during the period we're calling today the Berlusconi era, which has been grounded largely on the female body spectacle. When discourses on the body played such an important role in Italian feminism, from the concrete, such as the battle to legally and safely terminate a pregnancy, to the theoretical, I do not think it is a coincidence that women have been concurrently and systematically objectified on Italian television. That's not to say that these representations did not exist before these debates or before the Berlusconi era. Danielle Hipkins, sorry, I think twice today, cogently argued in a recent essay that the televised figure of the Italian showgirl has roots in Italian cultural history since the Second World War. However, she also points out, while the presence of these scantily clad women on television has existed since the 1950s, it has also grown to endemic proportions in the Berlusconi era. And recently, if you'll allow a brief tangent in the United States, we've had an example of the same mechanism in place. Thinking about this, I was reminded of the Georgetown law student Sandra Fluke when she testified before a congressional committee. This was early March of this very year. She testified advocating for schools' health insurance policy to cover contraception, and not just for pregnancy-related issues, but also for women's health. And most infamously, Rush Limbaugh lambasted her. And among his vitriolic and immature name-calling, the comment that irked me the most was when he said that he wanted to see Fluke, or presumably any woman on birth control, engaging in sex. Quote, "We want you to post the videos online so we can all watch," end quote. Well, there are several ways to interpret this statement by taking into consideration the gaze and the Mulvian sense, or the Foucauldian panopticism and surveillance. What I think this statement gets at for the purposes of my talk today is the stealth way in which discourses on the body were so manipulated into derogatory objectification. I mean to use this example metaphorically. Feminists rightfully insisted that society confront issues that relate to the female body. Berlusconi, as Limbaugh, epitomizes a period in which media successfully manipulated that very discourse. Today, one of the ways in which women are reclaiming their bodies in response to the corporeal commodification on television is through aspects of performance. In some of the photographs that I'm about to show, you'll note some women are not wearing makeup, while others have full costumes. Some are using props like strings, a mannequin. And so these are challenging the cookie-cutter images of what we are told is the ideal female figure. Some of these bodies are distorted through props and costumes, and the point is that it's eclectic. To invoke one of the hallmarks of the third wave feminism, that is intersectionality, the representation of the crowd is quite diverse. There are both women and men, and also different nationalities. There's a different presentation of bodies that includes a sense of camaraderie. It invokes that joy that echoes the practical shades of practice, particularly here. These are just some other representations. What's interesting about this is I think it is an early performance unrelated to feminism per se, but it's on a blog about feminism. Finally, I would like to suggest a reading that interprets these acts of performance as performative. That is, they do not only offer mimetic moments of Italian feminism, but they actually pronounce language. The language, however, is not utterable speech per se, as Austin's conception of the Speech Act is, nor is it necessarily Derridian iterations, but it is closer to that feminine tongue that many feminists in the 1970s theorized and strove to articulate. Judith Malina of the Living Theatre alluded to this language when she described a play that she performed with women who worked in the Faenza factory in '76. In order to address concerns that surfaced earlier in that day during discussions about the inability to speak and even the unwillingness to speak in the male rhetoric, their performance begins in silence. Quote, "At a sound cue, we raise our arms in the delta symbol of the feminists. We are silent. A tape speaks for us. It's a tape of women's stories, complaints, abuses. We do not speak, cannot, will not, do not speak. Tape speaks." And then the tape stops, and we strain in a chorus of nonverbal sounds. We stretch forward, and our mouths move, and our faces are contorted with the years of our oppression, and we want to speak, but we have no voice. End quote. This is a dramatic version intended as performance of what I think is happening in what we might call post-feminist gestures. When we consider Italian feminism from the angle of performance, examining the extent to which it is performative and theatrical, what we see is a new dimension of the questions on language. Historian John Pramata commented, "Our problem is not simply what to write, but how to write." As with the Autocoscienza movement, we can discover part of this is how, by embracing that piacere of collective movements and being present in those moments together. It is there where, in addition to speeches, editorials, interviews, and meetings, we might discover another language.